Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this webinar. My name is Jason Taylor. I'm the Senior Cybersecurity Program Analyst at Sedara, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about the NIST CSF 2.0. We'll cover what the NIST CSF is and how you can use it. It's really important for all K-12 organizations across New York State and even beyond to know what the NIST CSF is and how you can use it to reduce your risk. So what's our agenda? What's our goal today? Well, I'll describe to you how the NIST CSF 2.0 changes from its previous version 1.1. 2.0 was recently released last year in 2024, and we're going to cover some of the changes that the new edition brings. In a nutshell, it is a better kind of tool, but not a different tool in its entirety. For example, if you're used to working with the NIST CSF 2.0, you'll recognize a lot of the same themes and controls and guidance throughout the document. You won't see any brand new additions like controls related to new domains of IT or cybersecurity like AI or quantum computing or passkeys. Doesn't mean those things are not important. It's just that NIST CSF 2.0 continues its long-term theme of the controls that it already had. But it does add new information related to governance. There's a big focus with getting organizational leadership to help out with the cybersecurity program and ensure the whole organization is working to reduce its risk. So we'll cover the differences between NIST CSF 1.1 and 2.0, and we'll also talk about my favorite part, which is how you can actually use the NIST CSF 2.0 to reduce your risk. There's a lot of different strategies that we will talk about employing, and I look forward to getting through all of this with you. Well, let's back up a second and just take a look at what is cybersecurity. What is it that we're here to do? In a nutshell, cybersecurity is about three pillars. The first is about confidentiality. We need to ensure that private data is kept private, that only authorized individuals can access the things that they are authorized to access. We also need to be concerned with integrity. This means keeping data accurate and also maintaining the ability to know who touched data and when they did it. This is really important to ensure that malicious actors can't access something without you knowing they were there. The last thing is availability. We need to make sure that our systems and data are available for folks when they need it. We can't just make things so secure that no one can access it. We have to balance the need for security and continuing business operations. So cybersecurity is always about these three things, and I want us to keep that in the back of our mind throughout this talk about what specific cybersecurity control in the NIST CSF, what is it supporting? Is it maintaining our ability to maintain confidentiality, integrity, or availability? Why is this so important for the K-12 sector? Well, we need to ensure that our K-12 organization is secure. K-12 is critical infrastructure. It is too important for society to have something bad happen to it. If something affects K-12, students lose their learning time, they lose the ability for socialization and their social emotional development, and they lose access to, meals and other things that just support their daily well-being. It is too important to have something bad happen to schools that would affect students. But there's also so many other trickle-down effects. If something happens to school, it has to shut down due to a cyber attack, parents have to figure out what to do with their time to somehow, figure out how to take care of kids if school is canceled. We have sensitive data that we don't want to fall into the wrong hands. We have finances. There's so much, taxpayer funding that goes into schools. We have to be good stewards of everyone's tax dollars, and also, of course, reputation writ large. We have to have everyone trust that K-12 is a safe, wholesome, and welcoming place. And so K-12 education is critical infrastructure, and we must protect it from a cybersecurity perspective. Unfortunately, there are malicious actors that want to cause harm for any of those aforementioned benefits that K-12 provides. But in the back of our mind, remember that K-12, we're in cybersecurity, it's ultimately about protecting people, not just technology. And we'll look at that in terms of how to use the NIST CSF. It's about protecting people. So how do we use the NIST CSF or any other cybersecurity framework to support our cybersecurity? Well, think about it this way. Out there in the world is our threat landscape. It's all of the bad, malicious actors who want to cause harm for whatever reason. We are exposed to that threat landscape naturally. Just as a cost of doing business, so to speak, we are exposed to threats. And we need to lessen that exposure. Maybe we can't change our exposure to threats because, again, it's simply the cost of our doing business. But hopefully, we can implement some cybersecurity controls, whether they be through people or processes or technology, to reduce our risk. And at the end of the day, we end up with a managed risk scenario where we have trust and confidence in all of our cybersecurity controls for reducing risk. And that's exactly what we'll talk about in the NIST CSF 2.0. And my very last introductory slide before we finally jump into the NIST CSF 2.0 is a look at this great report that came out from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency in early 2023 about the K-12 cybersecurity landscape. And CISA recommends 3 different things in its first key finding for school districts to do. The first is to implement high priority security controls. Just like we saw on the last slide, we're exposed to threats in that threat landscape. We need to implement controls to reduce that risk. We'll explore later on in this talk what those high priority cybersecurity controls are. CISA also recommends that organizations follow their own CISA's framework called the Cross-Sector Cybersecurity Performance Goals, or the CPGs. We won't get to that in this talk, but it's a great read for anyone who's interested. We will get to note what CISA notes for the third recommendation is that schools follow the NIST CSF for a long-term plan. That's just what we'll jump into now. Why the NIST CSF? What is the NIST CSF? How do we use it? So the NIST CSF 2.0, here is the new graphic for the new framework. Note that it has that new inside ring, the kind of yellowish ring called govern. We'll talk about that in a second. But for those who've worked with NIST for a while, you'll notice that that graphic is updated now with that new internal ring. The other 5 kind of chunks there remain: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. So what is the NIST CSF? Ultimately, this is all quotes directly from the framework. It is a guide to help organizations manage their cybersecurity risks. NIST describes high-level cybersecurity outcomes all organizations seek to achieve. And outcomes is that really important word there, because NIST does not prescribe how outcomes should be achieved. Rather, it describes kind of what it would mean for an organization to be following good cybersecurity practices. It describes the end state, not how to get to the end state. There are several reasons for that, namely for NIST to be industry agnostic and flexible and holistic. But thankfully, this time around, NIST is actually providing some guidance on how to achieve those outcomes called implementation examples, and we'll look at those in just a second. So for now, we know NIST CSF, it's one of the most widely used cybersecurity frameworks out there. It's industry agnostic, and it guides organizations in achieving great cybersecurity outcomes. What is actually in the framework? Well, we'll focus on the big taxonomy there, which are the 6 functions, 22 categories, and 106 subcategories. That is kind of the hierarchy inside of the NIST CSF framework that describes all of those outcomes organizations should seek to achieve. So we'll look at those in more detail on the next slides. But I also want to draw your attention to the 2 other parts of the core of the NIST CSF. And those are implementation examples. As I mentioned, those are brand new, and they help organizations to understand how to actually achieve those outcomes that are defined in the functions categories and subcategories. And also part of the core that's been in other versions of the NIST CSF are its mappings to other frameworks, including the CISA CPGs that we looked at in a previous slide. There's other parts of the NIST CSF, but for now, we'll keep it to focusing on just the CSF core and its hierarchy. So the framework's been around a while, and as I mentioned, it was recently updated in 2024. And it's important, not just because, is best practice in the industry and also CISA is recommending it, but in New York State, the Ed Law 2D requires that school districts to adopt the NIST CSF as their standard for data security and privacy. So schools are legally required to follow the NIST CSF. And this is pretty interesting here because maybe you've already gone through these as a district, but there's various compliance obligations that you may have related to cybersecurity. In addition to FERPA and COPPA and CIPA and those other regulations, there's a few on the slides that are listed that are worth talking about. You may have gone through various New York State comptrollers audits. Those tend to focus on a very specific aspect of like the IT program, like asset management. There's also other maybe, not exactly audits, but kind of health checks that the New York State Education Department might conduct. And that's like against Ed Law 2D to make sure that you're following its requirements, posting your data privacy agreements, posting the Parents' Bill of Rights. But note, there's not, at least to this date, any formal audit that goes subcategory by subcategory in the NIST CSF to ensure compliance with each of its subcategories. So in the back of our mind, we have to demonstrate that we're kind of using the NIST CSF as our standard, but there may not be a specific audit against us for the NIST CSF. And we'll talk about strategies for how to actually use it then to make the most of it as our standard. Well, how is the NIST CSF structured and how does it compare between 1.1 and 2.0? A lot of numbers here, but you can see in general that the NIST CSF 2.0 has one more function, that's the govern function that we identified, one less category, and then two less subcategories as compared to the NIST CSF 1.1. So I guess you could say it's sort of a very lightly smaller framework. It's almost the same size at 1.1, but a few different taxonomy things changed around. Note, this is a little bit more apparent with the number of categories assigned to each function. With the addition of the govern function now, that function actually has the most number of categories assigned to it. So it tends to be, it's a pretty verbose section, this brand new one. While all of the other functions that we knew and loved from the previous version of the NIST CSF have actually gotten smaller as compared to the number of categories assigned to them. And this is mainly because a lot of govern-like controls that were strewn throughout those functions are now in their own brand new designated govern function itself. So the NIST CSF did some shifting around mainly to emphasize this govern function. So beyond just showing kind of the numbers here of how the taxonomy differs, I want to highlight now in the next couple slides 6 main changes or takeaways that I'd have for you between the NIST CSF 1.1 and 2.0. The first being, as I just mentioned, governance is now the tip of the spear. Listed there are all the new 6 categories assigned to that govern function. And at the end of the day, the moral of the story is that cybersecurity is not just the IT director's job. It's not just the data privacy officer or DPO's job. It really is, a cultural emphasis that needs to come from the top, from organizational leadership, including the Board of Education and the superintendent and executive cabinet and so on. The IT director and the DPO might lead day-to-day operations, but ultimately the accountability and the culture has to really come from the top with a holistic governance set of practices. Big new addition to the NIST CSF. It's really, I think, great that the NIST CSF is emphasizing that cybersecurity requires holistic organizational buy-in. I want to draw our attention just to show how that manifests in two different subcategories. So these are noteworthy here. Note that first subcategory listed, organizational leadership must now be responsible and accountable for cybersecurity risk. And they foster a culture, a healthy cybersecurity culture. That's really great. So as a joke, if you're an IT director or DPO, you can now nudge, wink, wink to your other, leadership colleagues that, look, got to help me out here. We're all responsible and accountable for cybersecurity outcomes. And also note another subcategory, zoom in look here is that we need a strategic direction for risk to be described by organizational leadership. So there's strategic direction for our cybersecurity program. So that's change number one, big focus on governance. But there's also, note that risk word in both of those subcategories. Change number two, an even bigger focus on risk in NIST CSF 2.0. In the first, in NIST CSF 1.1, there was around 20%, almost around 20% of all of the subcategories had the word risk in them. That's almost doubled. So around 31% of subcategories now have the word risk. It's almost a third of every control in the NIST CSF explicitly talks about risk. And at the end of the day, it is a tool meant to guide your organization in reducing your risk. So how does that look in controls? Well, we need to identify a standard method for identifying risks, for documenting them, for categorizing them, for prioritizing them. So we have to do formal risk assessments. If you've never done a risk assessment before, it's something you should start thinking about. And note too, we don't just, identify the risks. We have to, in that second control, allocate resources then to reduce risks, commensurate with their threats and likelihoods and impacts. So cybersecurity, NIST CSF 2.0, a big focus on risk, getting the organization to start thinking how cybersecurity specifically would affect them and their own unique risk profile. What about change number three? Well, NIST CSF 2.0 continues to increase its focus on supply chain related controls. NIST CSF 1.1, when that came out, one of its biggest changes was adding supply chain controls to begin with. Now with NIST CSF 2.0, it continues that trend and adds even more controls related to supply chain risk management. So at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we inventory and fully know who all of our third parties, vendors, and suppliers are. And we need to make sure that we have some cybersecurity related contractual requirements in place. For those who follow EdLaw 2D in New York State, we're already sort of doing this through the data privacy agreements that are required through those PII processing third parties, the personally identifiable information third parties. Think things like your student information system that has to have a DPA in place. But it's not just about DPAs. We also should have cybersecurity requirements in agreements with any third party that accesses our network. So think about an HVAC vendor. They might not be processing PII and therefore they don't need a data privacy agreement, but they're still accessing your network. They might have assets on your network that could be vulnerable. They might have accounts that they're using to sign in to access those resources on your network. We need to secure those, and we need to identify the security controls for that formally in an agreement. Very important to keep in mind. We also need to make sure that we're thinking about problems to our supply chain because we live in such an interdependent, technology-driven world. How would problems to our supply chain affect our day-to-day operations of making school happen? And we should include those considerations in our various contingency plans like incident response, disaster recovery, or business continuity. So the NIST CSF is hinting and talking about all of that stuff, and it's two controls here just to zoom in. As mentioned, we need to know who our suppliers are and figure out which ones are the most critical for us. And then we need to make sure that all of those cybersecurity requirements that we want to hold our suppliers and third parties and vendors accountable for are included in contracts. What about the fourth change? Well, I mentioned this one, and this one's really exciting. This is about NIST CSF 2.0's brand new implementation examples. That's their word for saying NIST is providing some, well, examples for how you can actually achieve the outcomes they describe in each of their subcategories. So note a subcategory here. It might sound simple. That's PRPS01, which says configuration management practices are established and applied. So what is configuration management? What are configuration management practices? In the old days with NIST CSF 1.1, that's all you would have is the concept of configuration management in your head. If it's something you're not familiar with, you'd have to phone a friend and get some help on what would it mean to do configuration management right. Well, now NIST provides to you directly some examples of what it would mean to do it right. And this is great. Sedara works with organizations all the time on the topic of like configuration management, and folks often have questions about it. And we bring up recommendations to follow security baselines. And NIST calls that out right in their first example. Use hardened baselines for system images and whatnot. Use security benchmarks. It's great that it's right there in front of you for you to access on your own as well. And they provide other examples for each subcategory. Each one has their own implementation examples. So the takeaway is if you ever read a subcategory in the NIST CSF and you're confused about it, start by going to the implementation example and see if that helps to clarify for you. If it still doesn't clarify, then go to the informative references and maybe look up the subcategory as manifested in another framework like the CPG and see if it will give you some more context clues there for what does it mean to do that subcategory outcome right. This is a huge change. It's really helpful and really excited that it's included now in the NIST CSF 2.0. What about the fifth change? Well, NIST says that there are 16 brand conceptually new controls in the NIST CSF 2.0. I'm not trying to disagree with NIST here, but if you were to read those 16 conceptually new controls, and if you were a longtime reader or practitioner of the NIST CSF, I'm not sure you would actually be surprised by 16 different controls. If you're a longtime practitioner, I think you might be surprised as a longtime practitioner of the 4 on the screen here. These to me are really conceptually new, and one of them is related to including the notion of positive risks in our risk assessments. It's an interesting idea, which is to say that sometimes we take risks and it's not a bad thing. Sometimes risks actually open up new opportunities for us. For instance, if you're an organization that has almost all of your resources on premises, but you're thinking about going to the cloud, well, that opens up a lot of risks to you, right? It could be financial risks, could be time and disruptions, and it could expose you to new vulnerabilities in the cloud. But it also might open you up to more positive things as well, like maybe cost savings or better ease of use and convenience for your users, right? So it's an interesting notion of just kind of a small thing here, but we need to start thinking about positive risks as well with our IT changes. And we already mentioned another conceptually new control. This is a huge one that's holding organizational leadership accountable for kind of owning cybersecurity outcomes. And then a few others are, NIST calling out the need to maintain inventories of data and metadata. This kind of relates to old school controls about data classification, but calling it out with a specific more light. And last is a focus on ensuring that we are continuously improving our cybersecurity program through formal evaluations, whether or not that's like annual penetration tests or cybersecurity audits or gap assessments like those that Sedara conducts. NIST is emphasizing the need for continuous improvement. So there's way more I could go on here with you about for getting into the nitty-gritty, nerdy details of these controls, and I'd love to, but for the sake of time, I think that's a short but brief highlight on the what I would see as the 4 conceptually new controls in the NIST CSF. Which, as I mentioned at the start, it's a better tool, not a different kind of tool. There's not any really brand new curveball controls in there. But the last change that I have for you about the controls, which is important, those subcategories, that does affect almost every one of them. They may not be conceptually new, but they're conceptually easier to follow now because NIST has done better organization with how the NIST CSF is laid out. As an example, we work with organizations all the time on the concept of vulnerability management. And we want to know, as an organization, are you regularly scanning all of your assets for vulnerabilities and promptly remediating them based on their criticality? Well, if you were to sort of track that concept of vulnerability management down in the NIST CSF 1.1, you would have to go look at all of those subcategories. So you'd have to go across 4 different functions, across 5 different categories and 5 different subcategories just to get at the same concept of vulnerability management. So you have to be jumping around through the framework. For those who've worked with it a while, you'll definitely know and the battle scars of sort of, trying to find your way around and the repetition and whatnot. Well, NIST CSF 2.0 alleviates a lot of that kind of headache by having better organization. Note now, if you want to find vulnerability management in the NIST CSF 2.0, it's in one function, in one category, across 2 subcategories. It makes it much better to work with. So those were my big 6 changes and takeaways for you from the NIST CSF 2.0. It's the focus on governance. It's a focus on risk. It's increased or continued focus on cybersecurity supply chain controls. We also have those brand new implementation examples. There are a few conceptually new controls, and then overall, there's improved organization throughout the framework. I want us now that we know what's included in the NIST CSF 2.0, to talk about how to actually use the framework. How can we actually improve the maturity of our cybersecurity program? If you're an organization brand new to working with cybersecurity, in a formal way, or brand new to using NIST CSF, oftentimes organizations experience analysis paralysis. There's more than 100 subcategories. A lot of the terminology might be new to you. How do you start? Or even if you're an organization that has been doing cybersecurity in a formal way for a while, and you're a veteran of reading through the NIST CSF, you can still kind of get bogged down of, how do I know if I'm making progress? How do I know if I'm actually reducing my risk? Well, this part of the talk will talk about how to alleviate both of those issues. And my tips for you for improving your cybersecurity program maturity are as follows. The first is to identify, just like what used to be the first function in CSF. That's figure out what is important to you, whether it's specific assets, whether it is different kinds of data, or is an easy way to understand different types of business operations. Like as a school, we got to make sure that we have instruction and payroll and transportation and et cetera, continuing to operate. Once we know what's important to us, now we have to identify how it actually works. What specifically are our important assets? Where are they located? How do they talk to each other in our network? How does data flow between them? And do we have backups of those systems or data? So first identify what's important to you, and then identify how it works. Maybe this practical example will help to clarify that. So there's 2 different general network architectures on the screen. When we work with organizations, we see network architectures of all types, and these are 2, redacted, of course, real world network architectures that we've seen for schools that we've worked with. You can see anything in green is something that you'd say that the school district itself controls, and anything in red is something that's kind of a third-party control outside of your direct day-to-day control. So on the left, we see this network architecture with 3 different schools that connects to a central MDF, a main distribution frame. You can call that maybe your network operations center or NOC, or maybe your central server room. It's the place in your school district where the broader internet connects to you, just like at home you have a modem. It's that place in your school district. And from that, you would connect to maybe BOCES as your internet service provider. And then from BOCES, you get to the broader internet, and there's firewalls maybe in between those connections. The point being, it's interesting to note where these critical assets for the school district are. They have some replication between on-premise resources and those at BOCES. Some stuff is just located on premises, like the wireless network and physical security, like HVAC system and cameras. And even some stuff entirely is located in the cloud at the broader internet, like the Microsoft platform or the Google platform or the student information system. If you don't have a diagram or a document like this, it's really recommended you jumpstart on that, right now and start making one to get a quick understanding of how is your network architected and where are the important assets located. It's really important for contingency planning, like incident response and disaster recovery, to know what could cause an issue. If a bad thing were to occur, where would, say, the so-called break in the chain be? But it's also just important writ large to make data-driven decisions about how your organization is architected. And that's really important because how it's architected really depends and changes the types of decisions you'll make and the controls you'll implement. Note on the right diagram, there's a much more kind of mesh network architecture here with a lot more built-in redundancies. So the types of controls, the types of strategic decisions these two districts would make would be different. Even though they're looking at the same framework, the NIST CSF, how they might apply those outcomes would be different. And the only way to know how to apply, controls and outcomes is to first identify what you have. So that's the first step, identification. The second step is to implement those basic cyber hygiene critical controls. So my recommendation would be to implement MFA as soon as possible on as many systems as possible. To patch your systems and replace all end-of-service life hardware, to have a vulnerability management program, to conduct and protect backups, and to document contingency plans. Those are the highest priority critical controls. Yes, they map to certain things in the NIST CSF, but regardless of what they map to, really, we encourage all organizations to jump on them. Note, it maps pretty similarly to the recommended priority investments that CISA made. Remember that report way back at the beginning of the presentation where CISA recommended 6 priority investments for school districts to follow? Well, CISAs are right here, and they're almost a one-to-one match. Besides, CISA calls out having awareness and training programs, which certainly are important. So jump on these priority investments, jump on these critical security controls right away, without getting bogged down in any specifics of the NIST CSF. Once those critical controls are in place, then I recommend get help with governance. We know now the NIST CSF, there's that focus on governance. We know we need organizational leadership involved. This is going to really help in the long term. So include other stakeholders however you can, other departments. Maybe that manifests in a cybersecurity steering committee. Maybe you're documenting roles and responsibilities for supporting the cybersecurity program through like a RACI diagram, one that describes responsibilities, accountabilities, those who are consulted and informed. And also document how the cybersecurity program is sort of governed and manifests through various policies, regulations, and procedures, and explicitly include cybersecurity in your organization's strategic governance or documents, like those state-mandated 3-year instructional technology plans. Cybersecurity can certainly be included in those and enshrined as a strategic goal. So if you get help with governance, it's going to make doing all the rest of the work for cybersecurity so much easier, because you're going to have the right culture and the right organizational buy-in and the right human and capital resources to support this work. So the fourth and last recommendation is to follow that long-term plan using the NIST CSF. Don't get struck by analysis paralysis using it. Break it down by function, by category, by subcategory. Do whatever you need to do. Break out an Excel spreadsheet or use some other process. At Sedara, we do this work with organizations. We conduct gap assessments with them, and we compare organizations' current state against the target state of the NIST CSF and provide step-by-step action plans and roadmaps for organizations to reduce their cybersecurity risk, as described by the NIST CSF. So however you do it, follow a long-term plan. So that actually concludes everything that I wanted to go through with you today. We talked about what is the NIST CSF 2.0 and how it compares to NIST CSF 1.1. There's a focus on governance. There's helpful new implementation examples, and remember that it retains its holistic focus on cybersecurity development and risk. And we also talked about strategies to actually use the NIST CSF 2.0 to improve your cybersecurity maturity and reduce your risk. Start with the basics. Don't get bogged down in the nitty-gritty. do MFA, do patching, do vulnerabilities, and then focus on long-term strategic improvements with the support of organizational leadership and using the NIST CSF for broad-term improvements. Hopefully that's all really helpful. I want to just wrap up by saying we at Sedara help organizations through this all the time. We offer 4 really different programs at Sedara, and the one I really mentioned today was in our top left quadrant here, as we would call it, and that's our Cybersecurity Development Program supported by our virtual Chief Information Security Officers. So through this program, you would get designated resources to help you assess your cybersecurity program and develop that strategic roadmap to reduce risk and demonstrate compliance with the NIST CSF, whatever it might be, from vulnerabilities to disaster recovery, to identity management, to network architecture, to data lifecycle, to physical security, to awareness and training, and so on and so on. We can help you out with that. So thanks so much for being here with me. Again, I'm Jason Taylor from Sedara, for tuning in to how NIST CSF 2.0 can help you to reduce your risk. Bye-bye.